Imagine your world, the authority you've relied on for centuries, shoved into a spotlight in speculation and uncertainty, turning it upside down. For centuries, the Roman Catholic Church and everyday life were intertwined to the point where your life was planned and orchestrated by the Church. Art, education, marriage, and other aspects of day-to-day life revolved around the Church. The Bible was interpreted by the Church, and the Church alone, as ordained priests, were the only to read Latin, leaving the public to rely solely on them. Ordained priests conducted baptisms, marriages, and social programs to help the poor, and most importantly, speak through the words of God. Your life in the 16th century revolved around the Roman Catholic Church just as the sun revolved around the earth. Huh? That's not correct. The Church is wrong? What do you mean we're not really speaking the words of God? Who would be making all these wild accusations? A German monk named Martin Luther.
To support his building for St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo X commissioned little slips of paper to save one's soul from purgatory, known as the infamous indulgences. And if that wasn't enough, the Church sewed little bits of wood and claimed they were from the cross that Jesus Christ himself was nailed to, the true cross.
Since society strongly depended on the Church and had no reason to think anything of them, they sold into the Church's decree. To further their income, the Church expressed how your deceased relatives didn't have an indulgence written in their name, they were suffering in purgatory, so you would have to buy more tickets to heaven for the people already in the ground.
Indulgences cost up to 2/3 of the average peasant's income. There was once an incident where a local church refused to bury a young boy in the church cemetery because the family couldn't afford an indulgence in his name. It is argued that this had a tremendous impact on Martin Luther and acted as a catalyst for his 95 Thesis.
By this time, the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Leo X, dug himself into a bit of debt with his military campaigns, personal spendings, and construction projects. Needing to find more things to make money off of, he started to sell positions in the church hierarchy. This outraged Luther as well, as the most sacred positions of the church all gain their power through some way of nepotism, which, in case you forgot, is favoring a relative or a friend for a position.
Martin Luther was studying law in his early years in Wittenberg, Germany, when one day he was caught in a bad storm and struck by lightning, in which he cried out to God for help and vowed to become a monk if he survived. Miraculously, Luther entered an Augustinian monastery and became a teacher of religious studies. Luther was committed to the idea that salvation came from faith and the grace of God, so that the enactment of selling indulgences by the church for more money, he was angered. He wrote down all of his propositions for the church on his 95 Theses and supposedly nailed them to the castle church in Wittenberg. The 95 Theses mainly talked about how the Bible could be interpreted by how you read it. This is why about a few years later he translated the Bible, which was previously only available in Latin, to German, so people could have their own opinion about how a good Christian lived and reached salvation. People were not supportive of this new radical outburst by a monk who criticized the church because, well, it was common sense during that time that you did not question the church. So the public's response to these new ideas was to label Luther as a heretic.
There wasn't anyone more upset with the 95 Theses than the church themselves. Luther was called to defend himself in his statements at the Diet of Worms, or else he was excommunicated from the church. In the meeting, Luther was given the option to recant his heretical writings by saying, "I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God, amen." This was found in his preface for his Latin writings in 1524.
Upon the refusal, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V excommunicated Luther and then issued the Edict of Worms. This basically banished Luther and his writings, declaring Luther of heresy that was punishable by death.
One of Luther's supporters, Frederick III of Saxony, or better known as Frederick the Wise, heard of Luther's apparent death sentence and took action. He arranged for Luther to be kidnapped and hid in his castle of Wartburg, while Luther translated the New Testament of the Bible to German.
Those who condemned Luther now had a chance to rethink their ways of thought once the German Bible spread throughout the region thanks to the printing press.
One of the most vulnerable groups of society to be swayed into a Lutheran way of thought were the peasants. During the 1520s, German peasants had the heaviest workload to please the nobility. Peasants had a long history of paying most of the taxes of the land, and in return usually lived a hungry, hard life. So when they, or the few that could, read Luther's works in his 95 Theses, they interpreted the idea that the nobility had no rights to hold over them such power. Serfdom was a man-made construct, and was nowhere found or supported for in the Bible. A series of revolts that broke out amongst the German peasants between the years 1524 and 1525 were deemed the Peasants' War.
Over the next few years, people started to officially break away from the Roman Catholic Church. Those who agreed with Luther's ideas identified as Lutherans. Those who partially agreed with Luther's ideas resorted to other branches.
The year was 1534, and all Catholic eyes were watching England and Henry VIII. He had just been dubbed King Henry, Defender of the Faith, by the Pope in 1521, just 13 years before Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. The act made the monarch of England the head of the Anglican Church and made the people swear an oath of loyalty to him. King Henry wanted this act passed to make his marriage to Anne Boleyn legitimate.
John Calvin was a French scholar who was also studying law and read writings of humanists. After this, he became a Protestant. Calvin's teachings focused on the strength and justice of God. He believed in predestination, the belief that God decides before you were born if you're going to heaven or not. This struck a chord with the people of the middle class, who very quickly became Calvinists.
During this time, it was found that the church was doing absolutely nothing and just marinating in shock at the fact that people started to question their power.
There were about 5 popes during the Reformation, but there was no response from the papacy until Pope Paul III. Pope Paul III commissioned the Council of Trent.
Church officials came together from the years 1545 to 1563 to reform and correct the wrongs of the Catholic Church. The leaders were there to also define the beliefs of the Catholic Church. Tradition and the Bible were used as the guiding terms, and so naturally nothing changed. All 7 sacraments were valid, purgatory existed, Catholics did not stand alone before God, and transubstantiation was real.
Back in England, fast forward a few years, and Henry VIII was finally given a son by his third wife, Jane Seymour. Edward VI was crowned king at the age of 9 when his father died in 1547 and decided that the court would rule on his behalf. Thomas Cranmer ruled a majority of Edward's reign and was the first Protestant archbishop. He contributed to the first Protestant prayer book, as well as publishing a list of grievances to the papacy known as the 42 Articles.
The Holy Roman Emperor and the princes of Germany came to an agreement known as the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. The treaty declared that every prince was able to decide whether his people were Lutheran or Catholic. It recognized no other branches. Lutherans and Catholics could practice their religion in a free city.
After Edward's death, Henry's first child, Mary Tudor, ascended the throne. She was married to Spanish Philip II, and together the two worked to wipe out the Protestant Reformation. Mary received the title Bloody Mary after she sent over 300 Protestants to burn at the stake, including Archbishop Thomas Cranmer.
When Mary died in 1558 with no children, the throne was handed over to her half-sister Elizabeth I. Reversing Mary's strict heresy laws, the number of people burned at the stake reduced dramatically. Elizabeth declared England Protestant again and was dubbed Good Queen Bess for allowing religious tolerance in creating one of England's most prosperous eras.
Tensions increased between Catholics and Protestants when James I and Sixth of Scotland was crowned ruler after Elizabeth's death. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, in which a group of Catholics tried to kill the Protestant king, was intercepted, creating a path for further religious tensions that would soon boil over into the European religious wars. During James's reign, he published and authorized an English translation of the Bible, King James's Bible, in 1611.
A series of civil wars throughout France, the 8 Years of Religion, ended the Huguenots' trust of the authority of the French throne, a key belief in Calvinism. The wars spread between around 1560 and the 1590s. Henry of Guise developed the Catholic League in order to wipe out the Protestants.
Although each of the attacks on Protestants resulted in hundreds of deaths, the most notable of them all was St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572. The attack was orchestrated by Catholic Catherine de' Medici at her daughter's wedding to Henry of Navarre. Fearing that her daughter would take on the influence of Henry's Protestantism, she ordered the Catholic League to attack the wedding. Huguenot homes, businesses, and possessions were ransacked by Catholics, along with an estimated 3,000 Huguenot deaths in Paris alone. The last religious war in France was the War of the Three Henrys. It started when the Catholic League, more like Henry III, made an edict that restricted Protestant rights and nullified Henry of Navarre's succession to the French throne. Eventually, with hundreds of casualties later, Henry of Navarre converted back to Roman Catholicism in order to obtain the throne. Once the ruler of France, Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes, which granted Huguenots the same freedom and rights as Catholics, and ended the years of religious warfare in France. One of the most famous religious wars during that time was the 30 Years' War, which is today debated on if it was truly fought on the basis of religion or politics instead. It started in Bohemia, when Protestants were dissatisfied with the new strict Catholic King Frederick II. Protestants reacted to Catholic representatives telling them that their religion wasn't accepted by throwing them out of the window, known as the Defenestration of Prague. Bohemian states revolted against the persecution in 1618, creating the first phase of the war.
The Battle of White Mountain was fought in Bohemia. It was the first decisive victory for the Catholic Habsburgs. The Catholic League, now consisting of a Spanish army with support from the Holy Roman Empire, Belgium, and France, led most of society to believe the war would end in Catholic victory.
The Danish became involved in 1625 when King Christian IV supported the Protestants in their war against the Catholic Habsburg. Denmark-Norway's 30,000 addition of troops to the Protestant Union only made a dent in the Catholic League. With all these Catholic victories, the Protestants began to sweat. Sweden forces decided to help the Protestants in 1630 with King Gustavus Adolphus as the leader. The Swedish king led Protestant victories on the battlefield and was killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. At this point, the war shifted into one of religion to politics, as everyone was just trying to decrease the Habsburg power over Europe.
The French, although majority Catholic, never really liked the Habsburgs and decided to back the Protestants in 1635. Fighting continued and casualties raised to an alarming amount. Disease, famines, and long periods of starvation wiped out everyday civilians who weren't on the battlefield.
Finally, after 30 years of bloodshed, the Peace of Westphalia was signed in the year of 1618. The treaty that ended the 30 Years' War restored Catholicism in Europe, though included Calvinists and Lutherans in religious tolerance and freedom. Territory was given back to Protestant lands, and everyone agreed that the Habsburg land should be reduced to control their power. There were 13 different branches of Christianity at the end of the 30 Years' War. Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anabaptism, and Anglicanism were the most popular.
At the end of the string of religious wars, after over 15 million casualties, the influence of the Roman Catholic Church over European life fell. Justifications of killing solely based on religion varied. The Church's counter-Reformation during that time, including their fundings to Catholic forces. As time continued and countries struggled to get back on their feet, a part of society found the religious wars frivolous. During the Enlightenment that occurred only a few centuries later, many called out religion itself to be corrupt.
The Reformation and religious wars flipped the idea of religion upside down. Martin Luther was the first to publicly announce the Church's wrongdoings, and those who supported him began to develop their own ideas of Catholicism, breaking off to different branches and therefore sending the Church into a counter-Reformation. Disputes on what religion a country would practice soon turned into countless attacks against Protestants and then Catholics, and then back to Protestants and then back to Catholics, until 30 years of fighting ended with a peace treaty that gave religious freedom to all.